Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the final webinar in our series brought to you by Hanover Fairs and CMAT. My name's Rob O'Byrne. I'm your host for the day, and we're very lucky today to have Amy Bentley with us. And let me just embarrass Amy, and I'll tell you a little bit about her background. Currently, Amy is the General Manager of Supply Chain Solutions at Toll. She's been the GM Logistics at Metcash, and something like 14 years at Woolworths in logistics and project management and all kinds of other roles. So welcome, Amy. It's great to have you join us today. And we're on this final one. We've saved the best till last, I'm sure. We really look forward to hearing some of your views about the whole pandemic situation and so on and supply chain. So let's get right into it. Amy, what are some of the main changes or challenges that you've seen businesses go through over the last couple of months, and how have they coped with that?
It's such a good question, given that, you know, an outbreak of this magnitude has meant everyone's been unprepared, I think. You know, and in particular, given our supply chain models built on just in time, lowest cost, minimal inventory holdings, you know, a lot of these things that we would typically say are good things about our supply chain have, in this case, during the pandemic, been our Achilles heel. On top of that, having had our customers' buying patterns completely change, I think has really rocked a stable but sensitive supply chain. So I think there's been 4 challenges that, you know, I would call out. One being obviously the financial impact, you know, a loss of revenues, you know, being corresponded by a rapid requirement to reduce cost base, you know, standing down staff, redeploying people, etc. You know, and that's good people who potentially be needed to get in the future. So I think that's a big challenge. How do you actually do that and still maintain connection with your people? Airbnb, as an example, recently stood down 1,600 people in such an honest and respectful way, but also very cleverly attached some really good business incentives to it to maintain ongoing ties with those people, which I thought was really clever. The other one is obviously the agile adaptation to a major shift in supply and consumer demand. I think some businesses obviously done this quicker than others, but a real key factor for everyone's been how do you deal with that latent workforce, the consequence of that major shift. I was really impressed actually in France within 72 hours of the French government's call for businesses to help during COVID. LVMH, who produced perfume and other luxury items, started producing hand sanitizer, you know, and that's something that I don't think we've really seen since wartime, that, you know, quick flip from one to another. One of our customers, Zara, did something similar in Spain where they started producing garments and things for healthcare workers instead of what they would normally produce. So, you know, they're still able to leverage their existing workforce, but do something a bit more nationalistic. The thing I'd call out here, though, is that their ability to be able to do that, it's not just about factory retooling, that's really having that quick, rapid response to raw material sourcing, product design, testing, and equally having a way to distribute that too. So I think that's the second big challenge I've seen. The third one's been the people management piece. I think there's been 3 big parts to this for people, as in businesses, and that's been clearly the health and safety aspects. I think it's been unprecedented, the type of health and safety implications we've seen as a consequence of COVID. So a business has been trying to not just respond to the business implications of that, but the people well-being aspects of it as well. The second part within people that I think has been a big challenge is the workforce management side of things. You know, we've obviously seen both this exponential increase in demand as well as a corresponding decrease. You know, a good example of where I've seen that personally is, you know, Toll's had to redeploy people really quickly to try and deal with this crazy uplift in demand on toilet paper. You know, so, you know, we've had to try and move quickly to address the incremental workforce need, while at the same time recognising that elsewhere there's a substantial decline. And I think the third people management thing that businesses have really tried to contend with is how do we have everybody working from home, you know, everybody who can work from home. I think a lot of businesses have dabbled in workforce flexibility and, you know, probably have some capability of being able to support that from a systems perspective. But just given how unprecedented this volume of people doing that is, You know, everyone's had to increase bandwidth on, you know, being able to use internet and VPNs and things like that at home, being able to use new tools like Zoom, etc., that perhaps weren't used before. And obviously then, you know, there's the risks that come with some of those things too. So I think that's been a really difficult combination of things from a people perspective. And then you overlay on top of that, a lot of our workforce are parents who have been trying to balance both being a professional and being productive, while at the same time trying to educate children at home potentially, which has been really difficult for businesses and employees alike. And I think the fourth challenge I've seen is what I would call system and digital capability. So those that already had great platforms have probably been able to respond a lot quicker to things like online demand. Certainly, I don't know if everyone's the same as me, I eat out a reasonable amount, and just seeing how restaurants in particular have really quickly moved to establishing online ordering capability and new delivery capability they didn't already have, just to be able to remain in business has been, yeah, pretty exceptional. You know, that whole piece around contactless delivery, having a quality track and trace functionality, you know, has been essential with an increase in demand on online delivery. So, yeah, I think those have been the big four challenges that I've certainly seen.
Okay, no, that's good. I'm just going to, we've just had our first comment come in. I'm just going to remind everybody, do type in questions into the Q&A box as we're going through, and we will try and answer all of the questions either as we're going or at the end. Amy, given your position in working with one of the major 3PLs in Australia, you obviously get a great visibility of many, many different businesses. Obviously without naming names, but what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've seen? You know, is it businesses just not coping? Is it, you know, have you seen businesses do really fast pivots? Give us an insight there.
Look, I think we've seen a mixture, and surely I'll ask a question to the people who are on this call, but look, I think it's absolutely been a mixture, you know, and some have moved quickly because they've got some of these digital platforms already, or they're already working with a 3PL, so they're able to quickly establish pop-up warehouses and things like that. In terms of what I've seen around the 3PL sector, you know, clearly the 3PL sector has been a critical partner in being able to support that adaptation and flexibility. There's been a huge need to be agile and flexible to handle, you know, all the changing customer demand and supply constraints. So, you know, a good example is Toll's working with Australia's Border Force to ensure that we can get critical medical supplies into the country. We're also responsible for the national medical stockpile, so you can imagine how responsive we would need to be in those kind of circumstances. So, you know, businesses like the government are a lot more organised around some of these things, which has been really good to see. And we've certainly seen that pivot happen with our retailers who are able to operate, you know, and even some who have predominantly had bricks and mortar have really quickly shifted to an online presence, which has been also had to shift.
Yeah. And I think as consumers, we've sort of been on the receiving end of that. It's, you know, there was everything kind of sort of collapsed a little bit online as various companies were trying to cope, but now it seems pretty well oiled.
Well, look, I'm sure the question will be asked, could 3PLs have done better? Absolutely. But I also think everyone could have done better.
Oh, it was the sheer volume. It was just so hard to cope with. Yeah. We've got some of our first questions coming in, and no surprises, they're related to sourcing. So will we see a major shift in local manufacturing, both long and short term? And then another question from Kerry around a lot of companies talking about greater autonomy in their supply chains, particularly production of essential services. You know, what's your sort of view on that? Are we going to see more local manufacturing and sourcing, do you think?
Look, I think we're going to see lots of changes in supply chain as a consequence of this. And actually, it's probably good timing for our supply chain to change, to be honest. In terms of manufacturing, you know, and that whole onshore, offshore piece, I know the government is absolutely, or certainly in Australia, certainly looking at how to re-establish and reinvest in local manufacturing for exactly this reason, to try and spread the risk. I do think there'll be a lot more businesses as part of their overall emergency response planning looking at what are their alternatives within their supply chain network, both onshore and offshore, and may include some form of local manufacturing. But, you know, I think always ultimately that balance of cost, comes into the equation. So it'll come down to what you can do locally and what you absolutely need to do locally in order to be able to address some of the issues that we've seen historically. We'll definitely see a spreading of risk. So I don't think we'll see people partnering with somebody for 100% supply like we have historically. So for example, Toyota has one supplier produce 60% of a particular product, and then they've got two other suppliers supplying 20% each. And that's purely to diversify that risk. And I think we'll see a lot more of that happen. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there'll be a critical aspect to this. So what we really have to supply here locally. For example, we had a massive run on toilet paper, but we have 3 manufacturers here in Australia. So we were never going to run out of toilet paper. But on the flip side, we don't manufacture nitrile gloves, which has been a fundamental requirement for our healthcare workers and actually a lot of people, even in restaurants and businesses that are supplying things to the average consumer in a face-to-face basis. Even supermarket people are wearing nitrile gloves now. I've got a friend in the industry who told me that they sold 6 months worth of supply in 1 month, and now they can't get resupply until May next year. So that's a classic example of something that you might, well, we should be trying to manufacture something like that.
Yeah, I mean, almost as a country, we've got to take the strategic sourcing approach, haven't we? And
correct.
Things that we can't afford to run out of, we need some local capacity. And in fact, Kerry's got a follow-up question there about resilience and the fact that, you know, this might all add cost to our lean supply chains. And I wonder about this myself, you know, how long will our memories be? You know, we're going to pay a little bit extra maybe for locally made product, and then we're going to get back into our old ways and we want the cheap prices. So it's
and that's why I started with that onshore piece. So I suspect we'll still go for cost, but what we'll probably do is look to get supply from multiple different locations. So it might be we get a supply from Asia as well as from South America. And maybe there'll be a small supply here, or the alternate to that is we're holding critical inventory. And Kerry's absolutely right. There's a cost associated with that working capital. So I can't see how we'll take a broad brush approach to this. It'll have to be product and service dependent. Yeah.
Okay. We've got our first poll question coming up. So will you hold more inventory in the future to cater for uncertainties? It'd be interesting to see the results of this one. We were talking about business generally there, Amy. What about the 3PL perspective? So, you know, you're in the industry, you must have a good feel for industry-wide how 3PLs have coped over the last few months. What's your view on that? What really good things have you seen, and what maybe some things where people could have been better prepared or reacted quicker?
I think probably the reacting quicker is probably providing more proactive solutions to customers based on what might be possible as opposed to what we could do right now. But I do think there's been some really great examples of where, you know, some 3PLs have set up pop-up warehouses for businesses so that they can completely change their delivery model for vulnerable people. You know, I think we've seen the flexibility of infrastructure being a critical element here, because some of these things have needed incremental space. Look at, I mean, the toilet paper example is a classic one. You know, 3PLs can technically open up capacity, which isn't necessarily always the case for an organisation supply chain. So, you know, I think if let's say, for example, those businesses were managing their own distribution, they might have found it a lot more difficult to get things to as quickly as a 3PL has.
I know that resilience and business continuity are things that you focus on a great deal. Are you seeing any major changes? Are people already, you know, putting a lot more resource into these areas? What are you seeing out there?
Well, supply chain resilience has become the new hot topic. I think
Mm,
there's a lot in its own right, doesn't it? I think businesses have typically, in these kind of situations, they naturally would focus on what are the short-term things that we need to do. And then the next obvious question is, well, how do we plan for recovery or get back to normal? And probably the question I'd pose is, but what if we looked at supply chain chaos as a normal event? And I think Laura Sears, who spoke at the last webinar, also talked about this in terms of, we're typically working towards being adaptable to a changing customer need, a changing channel, volatility in terms of seasonal volume, that kind of thing. But how do we treat this as a more holistic way in which to respond in a variety of different circumstances? And I think we've forgotten that we're a part of an ecosystem where there is a dependency on everybody within that ecosystem. So how do you actually disperse the risk associated with that? I think is going to be the big part about supply chain resilience. And I'm absolutely seeing businesses trying to respond to both that immediate need as well as how do we move beyond this? What are the opportunities that we can bridge from this experience? How does a business reform itself, as it steps out of, I guess what we would consider to be the immediate impacts of COVID, and creating perhaps what a new normal is, because I don't think anything's going to be the same as it was before. Neither should it.
It's interesting hearing your response there. I'm sort of reminded that, of course, supply chain was born in the military, something like 500 years ago, longer ago. Supply chain is almost becoming like military supply chain, isn't it? We have to be flexible. We have to plan ahead. What if certain nodes of our network are taken out for some reason? So that sort of flexibility going forward, perhaps.
Well, this is the interesting thing, Rob, because when you talk about, I guess, the typical aspects of what we look at, which is business continuity planning, that kind of thing, it's really around how do you deal with the situation. But what we're talking about now is how do we prevent it from impacting us as significantly? And then how do we regenerate out of that? How do we create something different that we didn't have before or we didn't think we could do before? As an
it's the preparing, isn't it? And then it's also having alternatives.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. Procter & Gamble in the US, they quite some years ago deployed a cloud-based solution to look at real-time information on production and external demand. And that was going through their supply chain control tower. They were also using this in conjunction with really advanced data analytics. And what they ended up using this combination of things for was that when Hurricane Irma was coming in 2017, they used it to predict which suppliers, which plants, which distribution centres were likely to be impacted by Hurricane Irma. What they did was that they then prepared contingency plans around that, relocated inventory, and actually avoided a significant amount of disruption as a consequence, and therefore avoided a lot of the financial loss others would have experienced. So that's the kind of thing I think we're looking at.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because we have the analytic capability now and AI and sensors and so on. I heard a wonderful reference where companies are tapping into those red and green lights in shopping centre car parks. And they're tying that in with the weather forecasts, and then they can predict based on the weather and the car traffic how busy the food courts are going to be. I mean, this is really where we've got to get to, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think certainly from an Australian point of view, what's really interesting when you talk about resilience is that even the government's realised that there is a need to have a whole of government perspective on this. When we talk about this ecosystem, government's a classic example of that. And they've just appointed a Commissioner of Resilience in New South Wales for that reason, to focus on all levels of government and all levels of business interaction in order to be able to prevent and protect, but also manage a disaster recovery if needs be. And I think perhaps we'll see a bit more of that in business too, where we'll combine a lot more of these activities. So, we currently look to risk management, but, there's a vulnerability here, which means we kind of need to bring together risk management, operational people got that kind of analytical expertise, the forecasters and planners, and actually start to collaborate together across the business and actually across our business partners in the same context.
Okay, we've got a very interesting question here. Where are we going as a nation on sustainability, carbon offsetting and diversity in supply chain? Are you optimistic about the future in these areas? That's a big question.
It's a huge question. I had a suspicion it might come up.
Yeah.
I think we're probably well behind where we need to be, not that dissimilar to where we're at with automation compared to other countries when you look at sustainability. You know, and I could say the same thing for risk management. It's the emphasis that our businesses are putting on certain things, and you know, typically it's been about cost and actually changing our business models in order to be able to cater for changing customer needs. But there's a bigger picture here, and that certainly includes sustainability. So I'd like to say we're going to advance in leaps and bounds on that, but I'm not saying that, unfortunately, and I'd like to.
There's some interesting things going around in social media, isn't there? That this whole pandemic is really just a rehearsal to see how we're going to deal with climate change.
Well, it's a real thing, just as a pandemic is. So, you know.
Another interesting question from Kerry. You've got them coming quick and fast. Has this opened our minds to more imaginative scenario planning? If we'd suggested this scenario 6 months ago, most would have said that'll never happen. I suppose another element of that is how far do we go with our contingency planning? You know, do we just get so tied up in it and so paranoid that we tie ourselves in a knot?
It's a really good question, because I think, you know, if you had have asked anyone on this call, and probably anyone actually in business, whether they'd plan for a pandemic, the answer is probably going to be mostly no, because of three things. There's an element of hubris. We live in a community where we have good access to healthcare and medicine. You know, we're not living in poor conditions. You know, the last time there was a pandemic like this globally was Spanish flu, and that was in the First World War. So, you know, there's an element of that. There's an element of likelihood. You know, would we have ever imagined that a pandemic would happen? Well, no, but you know, clearly now it's a higher likelihood than it was before. And then I think there's a comprehension piece here, which is it's hard to comprehend something of this kind of magnitude when we're so busy looking at I guess the things that we expect to happen on a more regular basis. So we're used to rail derailments, we're used to cyclones, we're used to, you know, hurricanes happening, earthquakes, etc., industrial relations activity. But what happens with those things is that they are all specifically focused on one part of our supply chain being impacted, not the entirety, and that's been the situation here. So to answer your question on scenario assessment, I think we have to consider any possibility of whatever it is that might affect larger parts of our supply chain and how we identify the risk.
Okay. We just had another question come up, and that was, are you already investing more resources in business continuity planning? 67% are saying yes. And actually, we didn't give the results of the first one. Will you hold more inventory in future to cater for uncertainties? And that was 46% yes. No, 54%. Interesting. Maybe people are getting better at managing their inventory. That's the flip side of that, of course. So we touched very briefly on collaboration. Do you see more collaboration occurring in supply chains now? I mean, it's pretty amazing some of the things that have happened around the world.
Oh, it's extraordinary. I think people are working together in partnerships that would never have imagined that they would. And, you know, a good example of that, I mean, we already started to see tech startups partnering with larger organisations, but I think that will advance as we start to see this shift and need for that AI and data application piece. You know, a lot of the businesses that have quickly established online presence couldn't have done that without partnering with somebody they didn't already work with. I think it's been really interesting to see, you know, these symbiotic partnerships being established, and I think we'll see a continuity around this. So, for example, I don't think any of us would have ever imagined that, you know, Coles and Woolworths and Metcash would sit around a table working out who would get what of what supplier product was available. You know, in a previous context, that would never be allowed. You know, you're allowed to talk about standards that were applicable across the industry, and that's it. We might see some changes in how we deal with things better for suppliers to be able to plan and predict better. You know, we've seen a partnership between the Australian Defence Force and our only factory making masks in Shepparton. You know, will that be part of our risk mitigation in the future, is how we work with government bodies in a different way to what we have historically as well. So yeah, I see a massive increase in symbiotic partnership.
Okay. I think you mentioned you might have a question for our audience.
I did. I wanted to ask the group if, you know, when they think back on it, were any of your organisations actually prepared for something like this? And if they were, what had they done?
Yeah, so maybe just type those into the chat box so I don't lose your questions. So how prepared were you? Give us some sort of context there. Have a think about the answers. We won't share company names or anything, don't worry. While people are thinking about that, based on past history, not really. Okay. We might take another question. No, this is a bit of a long one.
Just on that one, I think it's interesting. I know, I actually know Kerry, who's responded not well, and he's in this space, he's in this risk management space. So, you know, what's amazing is that Kerry's been in this space for, you know, a very long time. So for you to say not well, you know, it speaks volumes to me around any of our businesses' abilities to be able to prepare for
I think, to be honest, there is no need for anyone to beat themselves up over this. I mean, this was just inconceivable.
It was, but
it came at us like a train.
If anybody had actually, because, you know, it is something that is considered as part of a BCP process. Perhaps not that.
Yeah, BCP, but not to this extent. Yeah. Okay, we've got a rather long question here. Hopefully you'll be able to work this one out. So given the supply chain disruption, do you think the next wave to be prepared for is various innovations and different ways of working? Will this become a real focus? Historically, in some cases, a number of things are put into the too hard basket, given the need for flexibility and the need to change. Yeah, not sure so many things are going to end up in the too hard basket now.
I think it's going to still be this resonating factor around bang for buck. You know, I mean, that's our reality of business. So it'll be, what can we do quickly, cost effectively, but differently, like dramatically differently. And that's where I think these smaller businesses will come into play, that will, you know, bigger businesses will partner with, in order to be able to get that kind of traction. And, you know, those bigger businesses have typically not worked with small entrepreneurs because they don't have, you know, proven concept. I think we'll see a lot of that change, and people trying different things out of necessity.
And we have a great question from Ingo. Have you seen a shift to more relationship-focused contracts rather than purely transactional? Surely the value of freight providers and 3PL providers is now clearer.
That is a really good question. I think there's always been some element of a combination of a partnership version versus a transactional version, but I certainly, from what I can see in my short time in the 3PL world, is it has been predominantly transactional. It's very much been around, you know, you're the supplier. I do think there'll be a diversification around some of the customers that are with existing 3PLs looking to spread the risk across the 3PLs, and I think we just need to be, you know, facing into that. But I'd like to think, and I say that, you know, with my 3PL hat on, but also having worked on the other side, that we'll see a lot more focus on how do you partner, not just today for what you're doing today, but how do you partner to cater for what might happen, you know, whether it be for this crisis or the next one, or like we're currently undergoing multiple crises at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, given your perspective from now being with a 3PL and in the past working with so many 3PLs, it's a question I always ask people. Do you think our 3PLs in Australia are innovative enough and flexible enough? Do you think maybe this has been a bit of a wake-up call for some?
I think the short...
Or is that a very unfair question?
Look, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's been a wake-up call for lots of businesses, not just 3PLs. But I think the 3PLs have been endeavouring to be a lot more innovative, because they have to be in order to create a different value proposition for why a business would want to use that versus doing it themselves. You know, and that's always been, I think, the way a 3PL needs to work. And, you know, there are clearly my types of roles, and also I know others, you know, the other 3PLs have similar roles and teams trying to look at, well, what do we need to do differently? So, look, innovation's an interesting thing. To me, it's just really, how do we change the way we do something today, as opposed to just making it better. So, yeah, I do think there's people looking at it. I think this will advance a lot of those discussions, though, and probably get a more likelihood of piloting and testing we've historically seen in Australia. Because, as I said earlier, I think we're a bit behind on a number of opportunities that we see elsewhere.
We are running up against it time-wise. We'll try and do a couple more questions, but Amy, is there anything else that you'd like to share about, you know, your experience over the last 2 or 3 months, and maybe some key learnings?
Look, I think I've been really impressed at some of the businesses who've been able to establish quick online presence. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, I started off my career in Woolworths, and I saw them establish their digital platform way back then, and, you know, really work hard to try and build that online presence, and, you know, even just get consumer interest in it, because we've been well behind on the take up of online retailing compared to the US, for example. So it's been really good to say that, you know, this situation has really forced that outcome. Will now in turn, I think, force us to really seriously think about this last mile problem we've had for a really long time and been able to solve. So that's something that I think a lot more minds will be put to. I think it's been great, as I said earlier, to see some of these businesses really switch, you know, their manufacturing capability. You know, it's not just LVMH and Zara, you know, Giorgio Armani, Burberry, you know, luxury providers who've gone, you know what, we have a workforce here, we can do something different, and we can still make money, but doing something that's actually for the greater good. So I think we'll see, and I hope we see, you know, some more businesses thinking about the what if scenarios. You know, what if this happened? What else could we do? And I think that will be really exciting for the industry. And it's been also really nice to see this cross collaboration between businesses around redeployment. So I think very early on, Qantas stood down, you know, all its airline workers, and because of its relationship with Woolworths through its loyalty program, and no doubt a massive amount of business travel, you know, we've seen a lot of those people be redeployed where they've been needed. So I think that's been really fantastic. But on the flip side, I actually think we're going to see a lot less domestic travel in the future as well. Now that we've all realised we can actually talk.
Just don't need to. Yeah, we're travelling. I mean, yeah, we're just choosing not to travel, so we don't need to.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can rattle through some of these questions. A big wrap from Craig for Toll's e-commerce working really well. Will the free market address international supply chain disruptions, or is more government intervention required? So, you know, we've got this national medical stockpile. What about fuel, chemicals, things like that? We kind of touched on that a bit with the gloves, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah. Okay, this is a little bit of career advice. Quick answer for Imtiaz: would now be a really good time over the next 6 to 12 months to study a supply chain degree? Could be, I reckon. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, what we are saying is, you know, as businesses are restructuring and redeploying people, you know, logistics people are in really high demand. So I think that's fantastic. And yeah, I mean, I'd always recommend it because it's something I'm really passionate about.
And we'll do one more. Do you think we'll see even more disparity in the short-term cost relationship versus the longer-term partner looking for supply chain resiliency? We kind of touched on that a little bit, but depends how long our memories are, perhaps.
Yeah, I think cost will still be a very key factor, but I think businesses will be prepared to spend a bit more on doing something different.
Okay. Well, on that note, we probably need to draw to a close. Amy Bentley, GM Supply Chain Solutions at Toll. Thank you very much for coming along and spending time with us today. We could probably go on for another hour with questions, but unfortunately we are time limited. This is the last of our series of webinars with Hanover Fairs and CMAT. So personally, I'd just like to thank the team at CMAT for putting on these webinars. We've had some fascinating discussions. And if you've missed any of them, I think most of them are up on YouTube. And I'm sure CMAT will be sending us all a link to that. And personally from me, thank you for everybody who's actually been joining in and participating, and lots of great questions. It's been absolutely a lot of fun hosting these webinars. And I suggested to the guys at CMAT that maybe we should do a little giveaway for everybody. So don't jump off just yet, because we're going to do a little giveaway here, which I'm just putting into the chat box. And as a bit of a thank you from me and to CMAT, we're going to give away some online supply chain education programs. So if you can't see the link in the chat box, just go to supplychainsecrets.com and you can jump on there and get some free online training. We better get some more training material in there about resilience and coping with pandemics. So finally, Amy, thank you very much again for coming along. Thank you, Daniel and Lauren at CMAT and Hanover Fairs. It's been a lot of fun putting on these webinars. It was a great initiative from you guys. So, and thank you everybody for watching.
Yeah, and thank you from me too, to all who've attended, and also to Lauren and Daniel from CMAT. And thanks, Rob. That was a great interview. Much appreciated.
Okay, see you folks.
Bye.